A 6-year-old girl stood trembling in the woods, clutching a tree as tears streamed down her face. Her dress was torn, her legs scraped, and beside her, a scarred German shepherd barked into the darkness, protecting her from something lurking just beyond sight. A man was hiding behind the trees. Who was he? And why was she left there? If this chills your spine, like, subscribe, and stay with us, because the story behind this moment is one you'll never forget. The sky above Pinebrook, Oregon, was a quiet gray that morning, like a wool blanket stretched thin across the heavens. The air held that crisp scent of late autumn, earthy, cool, and tinged with wood smoke from chimneys that dotted the far side of town. Leaves in shades of copper and gold fluttered down the narrow sidewalks, gathering along the fence lines like forgotten stories. In one small blue house at the edge of Cedar Lane, a little girl stood by the window, tapping her fingers anxiously against the glass. Lila Jensen was 6 years old. She had warm hazel eyes that tilted slightly upward at the corners and wild brown curls that bounced with every small movement. Her dress, a faded lavender with tiny daisies printed across the hem, had grown a bit too short over the summer, but she insisted on wearing it because it was her mother's favorite. There was a quiet intelligence in Lila's eyes, the kind that made people say she seemed older than her years, though she rarely spoke unless she had to. She was the kind of child who observed first and trusted later. In the kitchen, Sarah Jensen was trying to wrestle the lid off a leaking jar of pickles. She was a woman in her early 40s with long limbs and a lean frame hardened by years of raising a child alone. Her light brown hair was pulled into a low bun, and she wore no makeup, only a smudge of sleep beneath her eyes. Sarah was a practical woman, rarely given to panic, but there was always an edge of protectiveness in her voice when it came to Lila. Losing her husband in a car accident 5 years ago had changed her, tightened her grip on life, made her wary of chaos. Since then, she had become meticulous in her routines, the kind of mother who left detailed lists on the fridge and double-checked the locks twice every night. That morning, she was distracted, trying to fix a leak under the sink while keeping one ear on her work phone speaker. Lila had been fidgeting near the door for 10 minutes, waiting for the man who said he'd come take her to the park. "Is that him, Mommy?" she called out as a soft knock echoed through the hallway. Sarah wiped her hands and opened the door to find a man she did not recognize, tall, thin, maybe mid-50s, wearing a worn gray jacket, dark jeans, and a navy baseball cap pulled low over graying hair. He smiled, easy and practiced. "Hi there, Sarah, right?" he said smoothly. "I'm Reed. John and I used to work together, back before he passed. He talked about you and this little angel all the time." He gestured toward Lila with a gentle nod. Sarah blinked. "John, you knew my husband?" Reed chuckled. "He used to talk about taking Lila to Pinebrook Park. Said he'd let her feed the ducks. When I heard you were back in town, I thought, maybe I could offer to take her, give you a little breather." His voice was gentle, his tone calm, just casual enough to sound sincere. Sarah hesitated. "I know it's sudden," he added quickly, raising a hand. "But I figured I could walk her there, 20 minutes tops. Mornings like this, kids should be outside, not cooped up, right?" Behind her, Lila looked up expectantly, clutching her little canvas tote bag with snacks and a drawing pad. Something inside Sarah stirred, a flicker of memory, maybe, or just the weariness of too many long weeks alone. Reed's face held no obvious malice. His voice had that warm, neighborly quality. And Lila, always quiet, had been asking to go out for days. Sarah nodded slowly. "All right. Just the park, though. Be back by 10. "Of course," he smiled. "We'll be back before you know it." Lila followed Reed down the walkway, her small hand tucked into his much larger one. She glanced back once at her mother, who waved from the porch with a faint smile before disappearing into the house. But Reed did not take her to the park. Instead, he guided her past the turnoff, down a narrow gravel road that led toward the far woods, where Pine Valley Forest stretched out in tangled silence. He talked lightly at first, about ducks and swings, about how quiet the mornings used to be when he and her daddy were young. Lila nodded, eyes wide, but said little. She trusted him, or at least trusted the idea of him, a friend of her father, someone who knew about the ducks. After 15 minutes of walking, the sidewalk vanished. Cracked asphalt gave way to uneven dirt. The trees thickened, crowding the path with gnarled roots and dry leaves. The sun dimmed as clouds gathered overhead. The forest pressed in. "Are we almost there?" Lila asked, voice unsure. Reed looked down at her, then ahead. "Almost," he said. They passed a broken fence and an old wooden sign choked by ivy. The trail narrowed further. Then, abruptly, he stopped. "This is it," he said. Lila frowned. "Where are the ducks?" Reed crouched down, his expression unreadable now. He adjusted her bag gently on her shoulder, then stood up and backed away. "I have to go now, kiddo," he said softly. "What?" Her voice trembled. He didn't explain. He turned around, walked back down the path, and vanished behind the trees. Lila stood frozen, alone in the clearing. Around her, the forest was silent. No wind, no birdsong, only the dull thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. She called his name once, twice. Nothing. Her lower lip quivered. The fear settled slowly, like a cold fog crawling over her skin. She spun in a small circle, trying to remember which way they'd come. But everything looked the same, endless trees, twisted roots, shadows shifting with every breath of air. She was 6 years old, in the middle of a forest she didn't know, and the only person she thought she could trust had left her behind. The wind stirred restlessly through the pines as Lila stumbled forward, her small legs unsteady on the uneven forest floor. The clearing behind her seemed to shrink with every step, swallowed by branches and shadows that twisted like reaching arms. The light had faded into a dull, cold gray that settled over the woods like a breath held too long. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, the air sharp in her throat. She tried to retrace her steps, but the forest gave no answers, only silence, and the low creak of trees swaying high above. "Mommy," she called out, but her voice was small and cracked, swallowed almost instantly by the vastness around her. A root caught her foot, and she fell forward onto her knees, scraping the skin beneath her dress. Dirt clung to her hands. Tears stung her eyes, hot and helpless. "Help," she cried, louder this time. "Please." Nothing. The shadows grew longer. Suddenly, a sharp rustle came from the dense brush ahead. Lila froze, her breath caught in her chest. The sound was followed by a low, rhythmic crunching, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving toward her. She scrambled backward, heart pounding. Was it the man? Had he come back? Then the sound stopped. From between the trees emerged a creature, large, dark, and silent. It stepped into view with the calm, controlled grace of something that belonged to the forest far more than she did. A dog. But not the kind Lila had ever seen up close. He was enormous. A German shepherd, thickly built with a broad chest and powerful limbs, his coat a deep black with subtle hints of brown along his flanks and paws. His ears stood tall, twitching slightly with every noise, and his eyes, those eyes, were a piercing amber, sharp and alert but not unkind. Scars marked his snout and one side of his shoulder, old and faded but clear signs of battles past. The dog didn't bark. He didn't lunge or growl. He simply stood there, head tilted, watching her. Unmoving. Lila didn't breathe. Her hand trembled at her side, curled tight around the handle of her bag. The forest, just moments ago overwhelming in its stillness, now pulsed with a strange awareness, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The dog took one step forward. Then another. Slowly, carefully. Lila flinched. But then, he stopped just in front of her and did something unexpected. He lowered his head and gently nudged her arm with his nose. It was so soft she barely felt it, but the warmth of it pierced through the cold. Her lips parted in surprise. He looked up at her then, head slightly tilted, tail still and low, not threatening, just present. Lila sniffled. Are you lost too?" The dog didn't respond, of course. But he sat down. For a long moment, they stared at each other, one small girl, one scarred guardian, surrounded by towering trees and uncertainty. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, a branch snapped. Lila jumped, her hands tightening. The dog immediately rose, body stiffening, ears alert. He let out a sharp, low bark, more of a warning than a threat, and positioned himself between her and the sound. Lila's fingers curled into the fur on his neck without realizing it. She whispered, "Don't leave me." The dog, who would come to be known as Shadow, did not. He stood beside her, shielding her as the sound faded. And then, slowly, he turned to look at her again, as if waiting. Lila stood on shaking legs. Shadow walked beside her, not pushing, not pulling, just staying close. Every few steps, he glanced at her, ears twitching at every noise. She didn't know where they were going, only that she couldn't be alone again. The forest seemed different with him there. Still frightening, yes, but not as hopeless. As they walked, a faint mist began to roll through the trees, clinging low to the ground. Lila's shoes were soaked, her dress muddy, her hair clinging to her cheeks. But she kept walking, and Shadow kept pace. At one point, they passed an old hunting shack, weathered wood, roof half collapsed. Shadow sniffed near the door but didn't enter. Lila peeked inside. Just empty crates, broken tools, and a long-forgotten coat covered in mildew. It felt like a place ghosts might rest. She pulled away and kept moving. Night was creeping in faster now, bleeding across the sky in dull indigo tones. Lila shivered, and Shadow brushed against her leg, warm and steady. She whispered stories to him, half-remembered fairy tales, the kinds her mom used to tell at bedtime. It helped her forget how scared she really was. "I think you're magic," she murmured at one point. "Like the knight in the storybook, the one that guards the lost princess." Shadow gave a low huff through his nose but said nothing. His head turned sharply at a rustle in the distance, but when it proved to be nothing, he returned to his place beside her. Hours passed. Or maybe it was only one. Time lost meaning in the forest. Lila's legs ached, and her eyelids drooped. They reached a patch where the trees opened to reveal a slightly clearer sky. Moonlight spilled onto the ground like spilled milk. She sat down on a mossy rock, exhausted. Shadow lay beside her, still watching, always watching. Lila rested her cheek against his fur. In the vast, dark forest, she was not alone anymore. The air was sharper the next morning, thick with dampness from the previous night's mist. Shafts of pale light filtered through the towering pine trees as if the forest itself was waking slowly, reluctantly. Birds called out in cautious songs, but the forest still held its breath. Lila was curled beside Shadow under a small overhang of rock and moss, her pink dress now faded and streaked with mud, her face still blotchy from tears but finally calm. Shadow lay beside her with eyes half open, ever watchful. He hadn't slept all night. Every sound, from the hoot of an owl to the rustle of leaves, was measured and catalogued. He had learned, through pain and repetition, that danger came in silence and surprise. Somewhere deeper in the woods, hidden in a thicket where branches grew close and the light barely reached, a man crouched low. Reed. His frame was lean but wiry, face weathered and lined with sun exposure and poor choices. The dark green coat he wore had fraying sleeves, and the cap pulled low over his brow did little to soften the cruelty etched into his face. His boots were caked in dried mud. His eyes, narrow, always scanning, were fixed on the direction where the girl had wandered the night before. He hadn't left. He never planned to. The deal hadn't gone through as expected, the buyer was late, but that didn't mean Reed was giving up. She was still in the woods. Still his ticket. He just had to wait for the right moment. But now, there was a complication. The dog. He had seen it from afar. A big one, black and scarred. Too calm to be wild, too alert to be a stray. German Shepherd, most likely. Maybe ex-police or military. Whatever it was smart. And it was loyal. It stayed close to the girl all night. Reed spat quietly into the dirt and retreated farther into the brush, his knuckles tightening around the frayed rope in his jacket pocket. He'd need to wait. Miles away, not far from the western edge of Pine Valley Forest, a silver truck came to a slow halt at the ranger's trail gate. The man behind the wheel stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, with weathered tan skin and short-cropped gray hair under a worn ranger's hat. He walked with the ease of someone who knew these woods better than he knew most people. His name was Carter Dunn, head ranger of Pine Valley. At 57, Carter had the calm, slow demeanor of someone who had spent too many years in forests and not enough around cities. He wore a khaki uniform, faded and sun-bleached, and his brown hiking boots had seen better years. There was a subtle limp in his left leg, a remnant of a fall years ago while chasing an illegal trapper. He crouched beside a spot where the dirt path narrowed, eyes narrowing. There, pressed into the soft ground, were footprints, too small to belong to any adult. He examined them closely, tracing the tread of tiny sneakers. They wandered erratically for several yards, as if the child had been lost. Next to them, paw prints, large, deep, purposeful. Not a coyote. Definitely not a fox. He followed the line with his eyes. German Shepherd, he murmured to himself. It didn't make sense. Children didn't hike alone this far into Pine Valley. The park had been closed since the landslide last season. The nearest town was 15 miles away. Carter stood up and reached for the radio clip to his belt. Ranger Station, this is Dunn. I found small footprints along Deer Creek Trail. At least one child. Could be lost. I'm starting a sweep westbound, no backup needed for now. The voice on the other end crackled back, copy that, Carter. Be careful. He didn't reply. He already had his hand on the tranq rifle strapped across his back, not for people, but for animals that wandered too close to lost hikers. He'd been here long enough to know, when something didn't feel right, it usually wasn't. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Lila stirred. Her eyelashes fluttered open, and for a second she looked confused, until she saw Shadow, still beside her, sitting alert. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. You didn't leave. Shadow's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't move otherwise. The morning birdsong filtered through the trees, but the woods still felt cold, still too quiet. Lila stood and stretched, her dress clinging to her legs with dampness. Her stomach growled. She looked up. Do you think there's food around here? Shadow finally stood and sniffed the air, then began walking, not running, not wandering, but in a deliberate direction. Lila followed. They crossed over a small stream, the water clean but too fast for a child to drink from safely. Shadow leaned down, drank, then looked at her. She hesitated, then copied him, careful not to fall in. A half hour later, Shadow paused at a patch of wild berries growing along a fallen log. He sniffed, then looked back at her again. Lila recognized the blackberries and reached forward. These are the good ones, she said, her voice still raspy. Mom showed me once. She picked a handful and ate slowly, juice staining her fingers. Shadow sat patiently. And for the first time since that horrible moment in the car, Lila began to feel a flicker of hope, fragile, faint, but real. Back on the trail, Carter had picked up speed. He followed the prints into an older section of the forest where few people hiked, especially children. And then, he saw something. A scrap of fabric, pink, torn and snagged on a low branch. He gently took it in hand. A child's dress. His jaw clenched. Then he saw the second set of prints. Boots. Bigger than his. Spaced too close together for running, this was someone walking slowly, carefully, circling. A man, most likely. And suddenly, Carter knew. He reached for the rifle again. The sun had risen higher, shedding light through the forest canopy in flickering golds and greens. The world no longer looked like something out of a nightmare, but for Lila, the fear still clung to her like a second skin. Her little legs ached with every step, and the skin on her arms bore tiny scratches from thorns and low-hanging branches. Still, she followed Shadow faithfully, as if some thread invisible to the world bound them now. Shadow walked with the confidence of a soldier who had memorized the terrain. His thick black coat bristled with dried mud, and the scars along his ribs and front leg were more visible now under the daylight, jagged white patches that didn't come from old age, but battle. His ears flicked forward constantly. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just moved, always alert, always scanning. Eventually, they reached a quiet clearing where the trees opened to a sunlit glade. A small, slow-moving creek trickled through the middle, its waters shallow and clear. Lila gave a small gasp of relief and rushed toward the edge, cupping her hands to drink. Shadow sat nearby, his head held high, eyes watching the edges of the woods. Once her thirst was quenched, Lila walked toward a log and sat down heavily. The silence was strangely comforting. The kind of quiet you could sit in for hours. She looked down and brushed at her dress, and that's when she saw something half buried in the dirt near the base of the log. A small, rectangular metal tag. She dug it out carefully, dirt caking her fingers, and blew on the surface. It read, in stamped letters, S. Red Elk, K9 Handler. Lila blinked. Red Elk, she whispered aloud. Shadow, lying nearby, lifted his head at the name. His tail gave a slight, involuntary twitch. There was something about the tag, its worn edges, the faint smell of rust and age, that made her think of forgotten things. And though she didn't know why, she slowly turned to the big dog and held it up. Was this yours? She asked gently. Shadow didn't respond in any human way. But he stood, slowly walked toward her, and sat, his eyes fixed on the tag. For a moment, something shifted in his posture. His ears dropped just a little, and the cold steel in his gaze softened. He lowered his head and touched the tag with his nose. Just once. Lila, still too young to grasp the full weight of memories, simply tucked the tag into her pocket. Not far from the eastern ridge, Carter Dunn moved steadily through the undergrowth. His steps were precise, and his eyes rarely blinked. He had followed the footprints from the narrow trail to the deeper forest, and now he paused near a dried patch of moss that bore the deep indent of a dog's paw. He knelt, placing his fingers near the mark. Definitely German Shepherd. And large. His mind wandered, not aimlessly, but to a memory buried under the rubble of time. A memory of a dog named Buckshot. But they had called him Shadow in the unit, because he moved like one. Shadow had been a rescue and search dog, part of a special program for mountain rescue ops, handled by a man named Samuel Red Elk, half Cheyenne, soft-spoken, a veteran who trained with more care than command. They were one of the best pairs Carter had ever seen. But 2 winters ago, a blizzard rescue went wrong. Red Elk fell through a ravine, and Shadow disappeared into the storm. Neither had been seen since. Red Elk's body was never recovered. Only his bloodied scarf had been found caught on a branch. Shadow had been presumed dead. Carter stood slowly, heart heavier than before. If this dog was that Shadow. He didn't finish the thought. In the clearing, Lila had curled up next to Shadow again. She was humming now, softly, a tune that didn't have words but felt like something her mother once sang while brushing her hair. She leaned against his side, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her small face showed something like calm. Suddenly, a branch cracked in the distance. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, stepping in front of Lila with a low growl. His hackles rose, and his muscles tightened like a coiled spring. Lila gasped. "Is it him?" she whispered, grabbing the dog's fur. But no figure emerged. Only silence again. Then a bird flapped overhead, breaking the tension. Still, Shadow didn't relax. He stood facing the direction of the sound for minutes. His body knew better than to assume safety. Elsewhere in Pinebrook, Sarah Winters sat on the edge of her kitchen chair, phone clutched tightly in her hands. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands falling around her pale, worried face. The lines on her forehead had deepened overnight. Her usually composed appearance had crumbled. She was barefoot, still in yesterday's jeans, her flannel shirt buttoned wrong. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall and thin, with strong cheekbones and gentle gray eyes that always looked slightly tired, but tired in the way of a woman who'd spent years giving more than she received. A single mother and a nurse by trade, she'd seen enough to believe in both miracles and disasters. Her husband had died 5 years earlier in a traffic accident while heading to pick up Lila from preschool. Since then, Sarah had grown both stronger and more cautious. Now, her daughter was missing. Vanished in the time it took to fix a broken faucet. She stood, finally, and paced toward the door, where Deputy Miller was still speaking into his radio outside. Miller was in his 50s, a heavy-set man with a trimmed beard and kind but wary eyes. He'd known Sarah since she was a teenager. And now he was trying to hide the fact that they had no leads. "Any word from Carter?" Sarah asked, voice tight. "He checked in 20 minutes ago. Found footprints and some paw tracks," Miller said. "He's tracking. He's good at what he does." "Just find her," Sarah whispered. Miller nodded. But inside, a pit of dread was growing. The light in the forest had begun to dim. The long shadows of late afternoon spilled across the mossy earth like fingers reaching for the girl and the dog. Pine needles crackled beneath slow, heavy boots. Carter moved carefully, his eyes tracing each impression on the soil, every broken twig, every shift in the scent of the air. He had trained his senses long ago, and now they guided him more reliably than thought. And then, through a break in the trees, he saw them. A small girl, no older than 6, sat curled beside a large, black German shepherd near a creek bed. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair wild with twigs tangled through it, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. But she was alive. And more than that, she wasn't crying anymore. She was leaning gently against the dog's side, her tiny hand resting on his coarse fur, as if they'd known each other all their lives. Carter didn't call out. He knew better than to startle a frightened child, or a dog with the size and bearing of the one watching him now. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible, his voice low and calm. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said. "My name's Carter. I'm here to help." Lila didn't move, but her eyes, wide and guarded, met his. Shadow rose to his feet. Carter paused. "Easy, boy," he murmured, looking at the dog's posture. It wasn't aggressive, but alert, loyal. He recognized that stance instantly. That wasn't a stray. That was a trained protector. "You're Shadow, aren't you?" Carter whispered under his breath. Shadow didn't respond, but his tail gave a slight flick. "Just enough." "I remember you," Carter added gently. "Red Elk's dog. You saved lives." He knelt slowly, lowering himself to the girl's level. "It's okay, sweetheart. Your mom's been looking everywhere for you." Lila's lower lip trembled. Then she stood shakily and stepped toward him. Carter opened his arms, and she walked right in, folding herself into his chest without a word. The warmth of his jacket and the safety in his arms finally cracked the dam inside her. She began to cry again, not in fear, but in release. "I got you," he whispered. "You're safe now." The trail back was steep, and the temperature dropped quickly as the sun vanished behind the peaks. Carter, a man in his late 40s with broad shoulders and sun-worn skin, carried Lila carefully in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Shadow trotted beside them, ever watchful. Carter had radioed Miller, but the signal had been weak. The closest shelter was the ranger station's emergency cabin, an old supply post about 20 minutes west. He would take her there first. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall lodgepole pines, its single window glowing faintly as he lit the lantern inside. It was a basic structure, stone hearth, rough-hewn bunks, a water barrel. But it was safe, and it was warm. He laid Lila down on the cot, wrapped in a thermal blanket, and stoked the small fire in the stove. Shadow, meanwhile, stationed himself at the door. He didn't lie down. He didn't wander. His ears remained up, nose twitching at every breeze. Carter noticed and walked over, setting down a small bowl of water and one with pieces of dried meat from his pack. "You've earned it," he said. Shadow didn't eat. He kept watching the dark outside. In the forest beyond, Reed had returned. He moved like a man who thought himself invisible, skirting behind trees, walking with careful steps, circling the ranger trail. His coat was darker now, coated with mud. His once slick-back hair hung limp with sweat. In his right hand, the rope he'd brought earlier had been coiled and tucked under his coat. In his left, a burner phone, crushed, tossed, then abandoned. Reed was in his mid-50s, average build but wiry, with eyes that darted constantly and a mouth that never stayed still. He had told people he helped find foster placements, but his motives were far darker. And this wasn't his first attempt. He hadn't expected the dog. That changed things. But dogs could be tricked. Or poisoned. Or worse. He was close now. Watching the glow from the ranger cabin, waiting. Inside, Lila stirred and sat up. Her eyes found Carter's face. "Are we really safe now?" He walked over, crouched beside her. "Safer than before. But we're staying the night here. I've already alerted the station. They'll send a team first thing in the morning." She nodded slowly, clutching the tag she had found. She showed it to him. Carter took it in his hand and ran his thumb over the letters. "S. Red Elk," he said softly. He was a good man. He looked to Shadow, who was still at the door. "He stayed with me," Lila whispered. "I know," Carter said. "He's a good one too." Then, for the first time since he'd found them, he allowed himself to smile. "I think he chose you." That night, while Lila drifted into sleep beside the fire and Carter wrote down his field report, Shadow never moved. Not once. The wind outside picked up. The forest creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. But Shadow remained, shoulders tense, eyes on the dark, a silent guardian. And in that darkness, a figure stood watching. The rope still in his coat. Waiting. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet. Not the peaceful stillness of nightfall, but a taut, breathless silence, like the trees themselves were holding something back. The only sounds were the low crackle of the cabin fire and the faint creaking of old timber as Carter stirred from his bunk. His instincts tugged at him like a hand on his collar. Something was off. Shadow hadn't moved from the door all night, but now the dog stood even more rigid than before, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, too quiet to wake Lila, but loud enough to send a chill through Carter's spine. "Something's out there," he muttered. He stood, pulling on his ranger coat. It was thick canvas, worn soft with age, and lined with wool. His fingers, calloused and precise, moved to the hunting rifle hanging near the door, not standard issue, but something he kept for bears and worse. He loaded it slowly, eyes never leaving the silhouette of Shadow. The German shepherd stepped forward once, then looked back at Carter as if to say, "Come see." Beyond the cabin, in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, two new figures moved among the branches. One was broad and heavy-set, with a beard like moss and boots too large for his ankles, the other wiry and nervous, with twitchy hands and a twitchier mouth. Their names were Hal and Briggs, men Reed had used before. They didn't ask questions. They just followed money. Just a kid. Briggs whispered. Why the hell would we? Because Reed said so, Hal interrupted, brushing snow from his gloves. We move in when he signals. You shut up and watch the door. From a distance, behind a curtain of pine needles, Reed waited. His eyes gleamed under the brim of his cap, his breath misting in the cold. He hadn't planned to call help, but Shadow's presence had thrown everything off. Now it wasn't just about collecting a child, it was about removing obstacles. Permanently. He had brought a hunting knife. Not for intimidation. For silence. Inside the cabin, Lila stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up with a shiver. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that danced on the log walls. She looked toward the door where Shadow stood like a statue. Doggy, she whispered. Shadow turned his head slightly and gave the softest whine. Then his gaze snapped back toward the woods. He paced once, then sat down again, but his body remained on edge. Carter noticed. He stepped over to Lila, crouching. Sweetheart, I need you to stay right here on the cot, okay? No matter what happens, don't open that door unless I say so. Can you do that for me? Lila nodded slowly, eyes wide with trust. Carter brushed her hair aside. Good girl. Then he opened the door. The cold rushed in like a ghost, wrapping around him. Shadow moved ahead, his body low, almost blending with the darkness. Carter followed, keeping his steps light and scanning the trees. The wind picked up slightly, enough to make the branches sway, enough to mask smaller movements. They didn't have to wait long. A dry snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, echoed from the left. Carter turned his rifle and aimed just short of the sound. You've got about 2 seconds to explain what you're doing out here, he called. Then I shoot. From the trees, Hal stepped out, hands up. Hey now. I'm just out huntin'. Lost my trail, that's all. Carter narrowed his eyes. You have a hunting license for this part of the park? Hal blinked. Not exactly. My cousin. You're lying, Carter cut in, stepping forward. That's when the second man, Briggs, tried to flank from the right. Shadow lunged before he could reach the cabin. The German Shepherd exploded out of the snow like a bolt of fury, slamming into Briggs's legs. The man went down hard with a scream, the air punched from his lungs. Shadow didn't maul, he pinned, growling, teeth inches from the man's neck. Enough to terrify. Enough to paralyze. Hal reached for something in his coat. Don't, Carter barked, leveling the rifle. I won't hesitate. Hal froze. From deeper in the woods, Reed realized the plan had collapsed. But instead of fleeing, he moved. Knife drawn, he slipped from shadow to shadow, circling the clearing. The cabin. The girl. That was the prize now. Carter was distracted. The dog was occupied. And the child, alone. Inside the cabin, Lila curled tighter beneath the blanket, her eyes fixed on the door. She heard the struggle outside, the growl, the crash, the shouting, but she remembered what Carter had said, don't open the door. Then she heard it. A soft knock. Slow. Deliberate. Lila, a voice rasped. Sweetheart, it's me, Carter. I need you to unlock the door now. Quickly. She sat up, confused. Come on, baby. It's safe now. Let me in. But the voice, it was wrong. The words were right, but the tone was too flat. Too smooth. And Shadow had not barked. She backed away from the door. The voice came again, now harsher. Lila. Now. She grabbed the first thing she saw, a pot lid, and held it like a shield. Her breath shook. Then the door handle turned. It didn't open, it was barred, but someone was trying to force it. Lila screamed. Outside, Carter whipped his head toward the cabin. Lila. Shadow turned, Briggs forgotten. He dashed. Reed was already forcing a window. But as the latch cracked, Shadow crashed through the back door, splinters flying, and launched himself at the figure crawling in. The two tumbled. Carter arrived seconds later, tackled Reed against the log wall, the knife skittering across the floor. Shadow stood atop him, snarling. Reed froze. In the aftermath, Carter tied the three men with paracord, radioed for backup, and made sure Lila never left his sight again. She clung to him, silent but strong. The girl had not spoken a word, but tonight, as Carter crouched beside her again, she looked up and whispered something into his ear. He blinked. What did you say? She said it louder. Thank you, doggy. Shadow thumped his tail once and laid his head across her knees. The threat was gone. But their journey wasn't over. Snow still clung to the underbrush like a stubborn secret as dawn broke over Pine Valley. The pale light painted silver across the frostbitten branches, but the shadows beneath the pines remained heavy. Carter's boots crunched over the brittle ground as he carried Lila in his arms, her head resting quietly on his shoulder, her small hands clutching the collar of his coat. Behind them, the cabin grew smaller in the mist, abandoned for now, but not forgotten. Shadow didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, the scarred German shepherd stood rigid at the edge of the clearing, head tilted, waiting for Carter's nod. Go, Carter said softly, turning his face slightly toward the dog. Draw them away. You know what to do. With a quick glance back at Lila, Shadow slipped into the forest like smoke through cracks, vanishing into the undergrowth with a ghost silence. The forest road toward the ranger outpost was long and winding, but Carter knew it well. The outpost was a small log structure tucked deep among the trees, built as a backup when weather or fire severed radio lines to the main station. It had a backup generator, a two-way satellite radio, and, most importantly, signal. Enough to call for help. Lila stirred. Where's Doggy? Carter looked down. He's helping. He'll be okay. She didn't answer, but he could feel her hold him tighter. Back in the woods, Shadow moved like something born of pine needles and silence. His breath was steady, his body low. Every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind was read like scripture. He circled wide, then barked, once, sharp and commanding, and took off toward the opposite ridge. It worked. Hal, his arm still raw from where Shadow had knocked him earlier, cursed under his breath. That mutt again. Briggs, paler than usual, shifted nervously. That ain't no mutt. That's military. Or worse. Reed, bruised and seething, ignored them both. We split up. You two cut north. I'll sweep wide and box him in. He's buying time for the ranger and the kid. Don't let him. But even as they moved, Shadow adjusted. He never led them too far, just enough to keep them off the right scent, to keep them guessing. A slow dance in the wild, guided by instinct and years of training that had never truly left him. Carter reached the ranger outpost just as the clouds began to part. The sun filtered down through the trees like mercy. He shifted Lila's weight gently as he opened the heavy wooden door. Inside, the space was bare but functional, maps, tools, emergency supplies, and the radio. He set her down on a cot with a wool blanket and went straight to the radio. This is Officer Carter Jameson, Pine Valley Ranger Unit. Emergency protocol. Child endangered. 3 suspects armed. Requesting immediate dispatch, nearest law enforcement, medical support. Coordinates as follows. The response crackled in quickly. Copy that, Unit 12. Help is en route. ETA 17 minutes. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Lila lay on the cot, still watching the door. A knock came, and her breath caught, but it was Carter, stepping back in with 2 mugs of water from the pump out back. He handed one to her and sat beside the cot, his tall frame hunched slightly from fatigue. Is Doggy hurt? She asked. Carter shook his head. He's smart. He's not trying to fight, just buy us time. Why does he help? He hesitated, then said quietly, because someone once taught him to protect people. He hasn't forgotten that. Meanwhile, Shadow led Reed and his men into a narrowing ravine. The terrain here was rough, choked with brambles and thick tree trunks. Perfect for evasion, but also a trap for the impatient. Hal tripped and fell hard, knocking himself briefly unconscious. Briggs hesitated, then doubled back. Reed pressed on, teeth gritted. But he was slowing. And that's when Shadow barked again, this time not from ahead, but behind. He had looped around. Reed turned too late. The dog was already upon him, not attacking, but herding, pushing him back toward the clearing, toward the road, where Carter had planted markers for the approaching police. Reed turned to run. The squad car tore down the forest road just as Carter stepped outside, his rifle lowered and his other arm shielding Lila. The cruiser skidded to a stop, and 2 uniformed deputies jumped out, 1 male, 1 female. The man was Officer Craig Matheson, mid-40s, sandy-haired and stoic, his uniform crisp and his badge dulled from wear. The woman was Deputy Elena Ruiz, younger, with sharp eyes and a low voice that rarely missed anything. Carter. Craig called. Down the ridge, Carter said, pointing. They're armed. 1 unconscious. Dogs leading them toward the trail fork. Elena's hand was already on her radio. We need backup on Ridge 4. Suspect fleeing west. Possible K-9 intercept. Within minutes, the woods exploded into controlled movement. Reed, exhausted and bloodied from brambles, stumbled onto the road, right into Officer Craig's line of sight. Hands up. Now. Reed lifted his arms, swaying. Shadow appeared seconds later, emerging from the underbrush with his muzzle stained with dirt and bark, his ears alert, but his body lowering as the adrenaline drained. Elena approached cautiously. That your dog? Carter smiled faintly. He's everyone's dog today. They secured the suspects, called in medics for Hal's injuries, and bundled Briggs into the second cruiser. Reed was cuffed without a word. He didn't look at Carter. He didn't look at Lila. But Shadow did. He walked slowly to the little girl, who now stood by the outpost door. She didn't wait for Carter's signal. She opened her arms. And Shadow, gentle despite his size, stepped forward and pressed his forehead against her chest. She wrapped both arms around his neck. That evening, Sarah came. She arrived in an old Subaru with cracked leather seats and stickers from national parks faded on the rear bumper. Sarah Red Elk was in her mid-60s, tall and rangy like a weathered willow, with long gray hair braided down one side and eyes that had seen too many departures. She wore a faded Ranger jacket, though she hadn't served in years. A retired K-9 handler, now part-time trainer and full-time wanderer, Sarah had been called when Carter mentioned the tag, S. Red Elk. She stepped out of the car and didn't speak for a long time. Then, seeing Shadow, her hand flew to her mouth. Spirit, she breathed. Carter nodded. He never stopped. Sarah crouched as Shadow walked slowly toward her. There was no bark. No whimper. Just the long, trembling moment when he placed his head in her lap. You found your way back, she whispered, voice breaking. And somehow, in the hush of the woods, with the sun finally burning through the mist, it felt like everything had aligned again. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the trees of Pine Valley, dappling the forest floor with golden patches of warmth. Birds returned to their morning songs, and the last chill of danger had lifted like fog after a storm. The ranger station had quieted. Emergency crews had packed up, officers filed their reports, and the wind had taken the chaos with it. In its place was something new, a silence not of fear, but of fragile peace. Lila sat wrapped in a thick, oversized ranger jacket on the wooden steps outside the outpost. Her face was still smudged with dirt, and her knees bore the fading stains of dried blood and forest sap, but her eyes were clearer now, wide and watching. Shadow lay curled beside her like a sentinel, his scarred frame at ease for the first time in days, breathing slow and deep. Each rise and fall of his chest seemed to reassure her more than any word could. From the gravel path, a dark blue SUV approached. Carter stepped outside to meet it. The car stopped, and a woman leapt out even before the engine fully died. Her name was Linda Harper, mid-30s, tall and athletic, with streaks of gray prematurely lining her hair. She wore no makeup, only the kind of exhaustion carved by worry. Beside her, a slightly older man followed, Tom Harper, balding, round-shouldered, with soft eyes hidden behind thick glasses. They were Lila's legal guardians, and they had driven all night. Linda's voice cracked. "Where is she?" Carter stepped aside and pointed to the porch. "She's safe. Right there." Linda dropped her bag and ran. "Lila," she called, voice trembling. The girl stood slowly. Shadow rose too, alert but not aggressive. When Lila saw Linda, there was hesitation for just a beat, then a sob burst out of her, and she sprinted across the clearing. Linda fell to her knees, arms open wide, and Lila crashed into them, clutching tight like she would never let go. Tom joined moments later, wrapping them both in his arms. The three formed a quiet, weeping knot of love and relief. Shadow stood a few paces away, watching, tail still. Inside the outpost, Carter and Sarah quietly packed away supplies. Sarah moved slowly, stiff from age but precise, as if every movement still followed the rhythm of a long-forgotten drill. Her eyes watched everything, especially Shadow. "I didn't think I'd ever see him again," she said softly. Carter glanced at her. "How did you lose him?" Sarah exhaled. 3 years ago. Avalanche during a winter rescue. He dragged one of my team out before the mountain came down. I thought he was gone. By the time we cleared the debris, he had vanished. And yet he survived. He was always different. Smarter. More intuitive. Some dogs follow commands. Shadow followed hearts. She turned to Carter, meeting his eyes. And now? Carter looked out the window where Shadow stood near Lila, still vigilant. Now he's chosen again. After the initial reunion, Tom and Linda sat with Carter inside the cabin, Lila curled beside Shadow on a blanket in the corner, half listening, half drowsing. "We thought she'd never trust anyone again," Linda said. "She's been through so much. Her biological parents, both gone in that accident last year, we weren't sure how to reach her." Carter nodded. She didn't need someone to talk to her. She needed someone who would simply stay. Tom rubbed his temples. "She keeps asking to keep the dog." "I figured." She even gave him a name. Shadow. Carter smiled. "That's been his name for years." Tom hesitated. "I don't know if we can, we have allergies, a small apartment. And after all this, he's been through so much. He deserves somewhere stable." "Maybe." Linda reached out and touched Carter's hand gently. "Would you keep him? Would you let her visit?" Carter looked over to the blanket, where Lila was now fast asleep, her tiny fingers resting on Shadow's back. "She needs more than visits." 1 week later, back at the ranger's house, a small, weather-worn cabin perched at the edge of the valley, with a view of the mountains and the whisper of trees for company, Carter opened the creaky front door. All right, he said, looking down. This is it. Lila peeked inside, holding a small backpack shaped like a fox. Her eyes scanned the room, wood walls, bookshelves filled with maps, a stone fireplace with ashes still warm, and a worn rug that looked like it had been there since before she was born. Shadow trotted in first and made a slow loop around the living room before settling by the hearth. This used to be just me, Carter said, kneeling. Now, well, it's us. Lila looked up at him. Can I draw on the walls? He chuckled. Only if you promise to draw mountains, not monsters. She smiled, a real one this time, and walked further in. Shadow followed her, tail swaying slightly. Sarah visited every Sunday after that. She never stayed long, just long enough to bring homemade biscuits, check on Shadow, and teach Lila a few tricks to train dogs. You're a handler now, Sarah told her one afternoon. They listen better when you speak with your heart. Carter often watched from the porch, mug in hand, quiet pride softening the lines in his face. He had been alone for years, not lonely, just distant. But Lila had carved space where there was none, and Shadow had filled the silence that once echoed too loudly. One night, a storm rolled through the valley. Lightning flashed, and thunder cracked overhead. Lila cried out in her sleep. Carter reached her first, but Shadow was already there, pressing against her side, his body firm and unmoving, anchoring her in place. Carter sat beside them both and whispered, "We've got you. All night. All storms. Always." In the months that followed, Lila's drawings covered more than just paper. They spilled onto chalkboards, the backs of envelopes, even one wooden panel of the porch. Carter let that one stay. They were full of trees, sunlight, a girl with tangled hair, and always, a large dog, with one ear tilted, guarding her like a shadow. The forest no longer felt like a threat. It was a home now. And every morning, they walked it together. In the end, this story reminds us that protection doesn't always wear a badge, sometimes it comes with scars, soft eyes, and silent loyalty. That even in our darkest hour, when the world turns quiet and cold, love can still find its way back to us, through a paw, a bark, a bond no one else can explain. In everyday life, how often do we overlook the quiet protectors, the ones who stay, even when no one else does? If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to believe in goodness again, and subscribe for more stories that hold meaning. And just tell me, has an animal ever stood by you when you felt most alone? I'd love to read your story in the comments.